How are you? And thank you for tuning into another video from the Open Author. My name is David B. Lyons, and today we're going to be looking at how you can improve your descriptive writing. Now, this is a lot easier than you think it is. So I'm just going to give you 5 tips on how you can just bring your manuscript alive and make it more vivid for the reader. So why don't we get straight down to it? Here we go. Okay, so as I mentioned, these are very easy to follow tips. So let's go with number 1. Number 1 tip in order to improve your descriptive writing is forget the science. Now, what do I mean by forget the science? Well, you're going to like this one. I mean, forget the bullshit science of the English language that we've all learned in school or perhaps in college or universities when we're learning English or creative writing or whatever road you've been down in the past. Because this idea that in order for you to write a novel that you have to, go back to school and relearn what a simile is and what a metaphor is and what's personification again and what's that onomatopoeia, what is that crap, I can't remember. You don't have to remember what all those things are. You don't have to remember about specific language devices, and you don't necessarily have to remember about syntax and about, the science behind a sentence. I mean, the reason we learn that at university or at college or at school is because there's a certain curriculum that we necessarily have to follow. And teachers or lecturers have to understand that their students know certain things in order to, tick the box and move on. But if you simply want to just write a book, you don't necessarily have to go back to school to learn all that, the science of the English language again. So if your ambition is to write a fiction novel, I want you to relax on that. I don't want you to punish yourself because, you can't remember what you learned 10 years ago at school or however long it is. So my tip when it comes to improving your descriptive writing is I want you to forget all the science that you learned about the English language, or at least forget trying to remember it again. Because simply put, if you're sitting in front of a blank Word document and you're trying to remember what a metaphor is, or should I use a simile in order to describe what's going on in this scene, you're actually getting bogged down. You're not being creative. You're actually you're turning the process of writing a novel into a bit of a science, and that's not what it should be at all. It needs to be a creative process that comes from you, from your natural abilities. So the idea of stopping and starting and stopping and starting writing your novel because you're bogged down by the science of the English language, forget it. I don't want that to be impactful on your creative process, okay? So forget the science behind the English language. It's not going to help you. What will help you is if you read a lot. So if you are a keen reader of the genre that you want to write in, well then the more you read, the more you're learning, even though you're not necessarily doing exams or tests and that. So if you are reading books quite often, well then you're learning about pace, you're learning about how to deliver plot, and you're learning about characterization and syntax and how to describe without having to go back to school. So you already know the pacing. You already understand what a book looks like, what a book feels like, how it impacts a reader. So don't feel as if you have to go back to school to write a book. If you're reading a lot, you already know a lot of the basics, and we can help you from there. So rule number 1, forget the science. You don't need it. Now, tip number 2 in order to improve your descriptive writing is visualize your scene. Now, this is quite simple, okay? And it's a very, very easy exercise to follow and to do on a regular basis. And if you do it, I promise you, it will help you bring your manuscript more alive. It will help you bring certain scenes more alive. And this is how simple it is, right? So anytime you're creating a new character, I just want you to close your eyes and picture that character. Because if you can't picture that character, well then, no matter how good a writer you are, your reader is never going to be able to picture that character. That goes hand in hand. That's very simple. And it's the same with every scene. So when you put your characters in a new scene or in a new setting, well, again, I want you to just close your eyes, even just for 20 or 30 seconds, and imagine and picture that scene in your head. Because again, very simply, if you can't picture that scene, there's no fucking way your reader is going to be able to picture that scene from your writing. Because if you don't know what it looks like, they don't know what it looks like, and it's very simple. Now this is such a minute task. As I said, it only takes 20 seconds. But if you do it, well then you already have that vision, and it's just a matter of your skill set of sprinkling that vision into words that will help it come alive for your reader. So it's something that people don't do regularly enough. When you are putting your characters in a new setting, close your eyes for 20 seconds, imagine that setting, understand what it looks like, what it tastes like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, and when it comes to describing it, well then you will know everything about that particular scene. But I'm not saying you describe it in every detail. In fact, we're going to go into that now in a few minutes. But if you just visualize what your scene looks like, well then it makes the whole process of descriptive writing a lot easier. It's a very simple tip, but yet it's a tip most writers don't use. I urge you to use it in future. Now let's move on to tip number 3. We're going to get a bit more technical now. So tip number 3 when it comes to improving your descriptive writing is be subtle. Now I know you've heard this from me before, and I'm a big advocate of everybody being subtle when it comes to plot, when it comes to character description, which we're going to talk about now, when it comes to including in your hook, when it comes to your everyday storytelling. I just think the biggest difference between an amateur manuscript and a professional publishable manuscript is the subtlety that's in the latter, okay? Because so many people who are writing amateur manuscripts or they're writing for the first time, they tend to overplay their hand, they overact, which I think is something I've taught you about before. So people are just over eager to over describe, and I'm going to give you an example of it now. So let's take a look at the over description of characters, which seems to go on very often in a lot of my student manuscripts, and I'm going to teach you then how you can rein it back and be a lot more subtle when it comes to character description. So let's pretend that this guy here is a character in your novel, and you're introducing him for the first time and you describe what he looks like, okay? So a student manuscript or an amateur manuscript would tend to over describe, and let's just have a quick look at something akin to what an amateur writer would write to describe this character. He sported a scruffy beard, almost as if he'd forgotten to shave for the past month. It was stubbly and peppered in colour, parts of it black, parts of it white. The bags under his eyes were heavy, his hair greasy. His skin looked tired, as if it hadn't been touched by moisturiser over the course of its entire lifetime. His hair wasn't as light in colour as his beard, but there were signs of whiteness fighting through. Now, you mightn't think that that's bad description, and it's not the worst description, but what it really is just a list of things that describe what the character looks like. And it's really not good enough to do that, really, not if you really want your manuscript to be publishable or to be recognised by agents or publishers. So what we did there was, in that example, it's a bad example even though it probably read okay, but it's a bad example because it's just bullet point notes of what the character looks like, and it's overreaching, it's overacting, as I call it. We just really used one of the senses to describe what the character looks like, because we just talked about what he looks like. But I'll go into that in a bit more detail about the senses. It's actually my next tip. But let's take a look at how you can totally rein that back and give your character, or give your readers, a description of what your character looks like in the most subtle of ways. So that was an example of what an amateur writer might write to describe a character. Let's have a look at what a professional might do in order to give off the impression of what their character looks like. So they might write something as simple as this. Kelly didn't want him to hug her, but he stepped forward and she knew an embrace was inevitable. She could smell him before his arms were around her. But it wasn't a musty body odour stench that filled her nostrils. It was the stale stench of cigarettes. His stubble scratched at her cheek as he leaned in. She unwrapped her hands quickly, ensuring the hug lasted less than 2 seconds, then politely smiled at his troubled face. Now that gives sort of a description of that male character, yet it's not just a bullet point list of what he looks like. We have seen or understood what the character looks like through Kelly's feelings when she's around him. And we use an array of the senses to do that. And I'm going to talk about that, as I mentioned, in a minute, about the senses. So there's this idea that you have to bullet point describe a character every time you introduce a new character. Like, you have to describe what his hair looks like, his beard in that situation, the bags under his eyes, but that's not how you do description of a character. So you might just subtly plot it in, as I have done there, through Kelly's that character Kelly's reluctance to give him a hug because of what he looks like and what he might smell like, and then we felt the brush of his, or she felt the brush of his beard brushing against her cheek. So that's a better way to introduce a description of a character than to just bullet point list a whole load of what he looks like. And it's the same for setting as well. So amateur writers seem to describe everything when they are introducing a new setting. So if their characters walk into a new room, they describe everything in that room. Again, you need to be subtle. And what you really need to do is move on to my next tip in order to do that. So remember, tip number 3 is be subtle. But let's have a look at how we can be more subtle with tip number 4, which is use the senses. I know I told you that you didn't have to go back to school in order to learn how to write more descriptively, but if we just remember what the senses are, and we did learn them at school, well then it will really help with our descriptive writing. So the senses are, you know, the 5 of them: sight, sound, taste, touch, and smell. So, I mean, the problem is an awful lot of amateur writers, they tend to only use one of them to describe characters, and that is sight. So they just list what the character looks like. But you can be much more descriptive and much more vivid with your writing if you open up the idea of using the different senses to describe what a character looks like. So, for example, let's take a look at the amateur paragraph that I wrote to describe that character again. So we can see it here. It is just a list of what that man looks like. This is what he looks like. Again, this is what he looks like. This is what he looks like. This is what he looks like. Through every sentence in that paragraph, it's just a description of what he looks like. So that's a prime example of a writer just using one of the senses, sight, to describe what a character looks like. But if we look at the more professional description of the character, you know, through this other character, Kelly, and her feelings or her reluctance to touch him or hug him, you will see a vast difference here in the use of the senses. So if we look here, we're talking about smell, the body odor or the stale stench of cigarettes, and then we're also talking about touch here, because you see here his stubble scratched at her cheek. So through this sort of description, we are learning what the character looks like, but it's not just a list of what he looks like, we're learning it through different senses. So if you bear in mind the senses at all times when it comes to the description, now it could be describing characters, or it could be describing a setting or a scene, but I just want you to be conscious all the time of the different senses. Now I don't want you to jam them in and think, oh well, that bald, the open author guy said I should use senses all the time. I'm not saying you should fit them in for the sake of it, so I don't want you to constantly use smell or constantly use touch or taste. I just want you to use it when you can. And remember, my last tip was be subtle. So an awful lot of amateur writers, when I give them this advice to use the senses, well, then they go overboard with smells, and you know, they write that a character walked into a room and the room smelt like a cross between petrol and stale coffee, and you're just thinking that's not necessarily the type of sense you would get if you walked into a room. So don't overplay the senses, but I would give you the tip of always being conscious of the 5 senses, because it gives you a different direction and it allows you to be more subtle when it comes to describing characters and to describing scenes. So that tip is be aware of your senses and have them in mind at all times, and it will help you with your descriptive writing. Let's move on to the next tip. Tip number 5 when it comes to helping you describe more vividly is kill your adverbs. Yep, that old chestnut. Now, let me tell you why this will help you with your descriptive writing and help bring your manuscript more alive and more vivid. So, I think I've said this to you before in other videos. One distinct and very obvious difference between a student manuscript or an amateur manuscript and a publishable professional manuscript on first sight is the amount of ly words you will see in the amateur manuscript. Very obvious. I can look at a page and understand that this is not necessarily professional on first glance. And ly words or adverbs are descriptive words that end in ly. Okay, so we'll go through a couple of examples now and how you can improve it. Now the thing is about this, you're going to look at these two sentences and think, well, bald, open auto guide, that's, you know, there's very little difference between those two sentences, and you're right, there are. But let me just explain to you just a little after this example of why it works and why it can help your manuscript become more vivid and improve your descriptive writing. So for example, an amateur writer might write something like this. She closed the door and walked quickly up the path, which is fine. It's probably the default sentence we would use to describe somebody closing a door and wanting to rush out of their home pretty quickly. But if you take the ly word out of it, if you take the adverb out of it, well, then suddenly you find yourself stretching your vocab bank and looking for something other than just walked quickly. So a professional might write something like this. She closed the door and paced up the path. Now I know you're thinking, that's not a huge difference. There's not a major difference between she closed the door and walked quickly up the path and she closed the door and paced up the path. But think of it this way. When you think you're writing an 80,000 word manuscript, you are probably likely to have between 250 and 350 ly words or adverbs in there. And ly words or adverbs are actually seen as crutch tells, and they're seen as sort of the writer in fear that they're not getting their point across, so they add in an adverb to just re-stamp exactly what they mean. But if you change those 300, let's say 300 adverbs in your manuscript, and you're conscious of this tip of, you know, lose your adverbs or kill your adverbs, well then what you'll find is, instead of using walked quickly, you will be changing it to paced. Or instead of using ran quickly, you're changing it to sprinted or raced. And suddenly, if you're doing that 300 times throughout your manuscript, you're losing the adverb and replacing it with a higher vocabulary word than just walked or ran, well then suddenly your manuscript is becoming more vivid. Now you think it's only a minute change when you see it changed once, but when you think of it being changed 300 times throughout a whole manuscript, you will find your writing improving no end. Now, I'm going to give you another example which is sort of frowned upon in the industry. And people tend to use adverbs a lot to describe how dialogue is said. And I'm gonna tell you why it's not a good thing to do. So rather than using he ran quickly up the garden path or she walked quickly up the garden path, you will use she paced up the garden path. And I know it only makes a subtle difference to that one sentence, but throughout your whole manuscript you will find you're using better vocabulary throughout for more description. Okay, so it does work. Even though it looks like it's minimal, it does work overall to help paint pictures in your readers' minds, which is the end goal of a writer, of course. But just to go back on what I said there about using it as a dialogue tag, let's have a look at this example of some bad writing. Don't you dare, she spat out angrily. Now, I see this all the time in my students' work, and you know, I get my big red pen out and I'm underlining and circling. I don't like adverbs used as dialogue tags because it shows a weakness in writing, and again it's used as a crutch tell here because you're just trying to tell your reader how your character is saying something. But you can do that a lot more subtly if you get rid of that adverb and replace it. So you're trying to, in that example there, the writer's trying to say that the girl said something angrily, that she's angry as she's saying don't you dare. Angrily my ass is what I say to this, okay? Get rid of it. You're telling your reader how your character said something. When you know that telling, we all know that telling is an amateur game. So we need to show it. We need to describe it a bit more subtly. So let's take a look at this. She clenched her fist until her knuckles turned white. Don't you dare, she said. Now that gets across the fact that she's angry because we are being given a vivid description of her clenching her fist, or until her knuckles turn white, and then she says the dialogue. So rather than say don't you dare, she spat out angrily, right, she clenched her fist until her knuckles turned white. Don't you dare, she said. That's a much more subtle and much more effective way of describing or putting an image in your reader's mind. So if you are conscious of kill the adverbs, and I do want you to be conscious of it at all times, you will find that your descriptive writing is improving no end. Even if you only think it's minute at the time when you're changing one, you will find that if you do it throughout your whole manuscript, your whole story is becoming more alive. So that's my 5th tip on how to improve your descriptive writing. I hope this video helped you out some way. Of course, it's this video or any of my videos alone is not going to help you become a writer or a published writer. But if you do bear with me and watch all my videos, I am hoping, or the aim is, that I can help you get that manuscript finished and then get it into the hands of good publishers and agents. So do subscribe to my videos. Just click that red button below and you will get access to all my videos as they come out. As I mentioned, I am doing one every week for the next year. A lot of my videos are based on the lectures I give at university or at colleges and that I have done over the past few years, and also my experience as an editor and as an author myself. So if you are interested in writing a book and you haven't even begun, I would urge you to click onto my Facebook page, which is Future Authors Society. There's a host of people on there who are trying to write their first book, and we're just giving each other help with hints and tips of how they can begin the process of writing the book. So if you're interested, do join. I look forward to seeing you there. If not, I'll see you at the next video. How about that? Okay, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you soon.